Hello all, my name is Mary Markham. I am a former NDT debater for the University of Wyoming, and today I will be giving an introductory lecture on topicality. Some of my goals for today's lecture are to go over what topicality is and to provide you with some explanations for why teams choose to read topicality when they are on the negative. Then I want to discuss the parts that make up a topicality argument on the negative, and to also provide you with some common responses that are made by affirmative teams who are debating against topicality. Then I want to go over some of the ways that you can execute on topicality when you are on the negative. And finally, I want to discuss how to debate against topicality when you are on the affirmative. So first and foremost, what is topicality? Topicality is a procedural issue that aims to determine if the affirmative has gone beyond the scope of the resolution. At the beginning of every year, all of you receive a very specific topic or resolution that you are expected to engage in for a year's worth of debates. So this year's resolution is the United States federal government should substantially increase its economic and/or diplomatic engagement with the People's Republic of China. Now, when all of you enter into debates, there's kind of this implicit assumption that an affirmative team will get up and they will read a plan, which is oftentimes a hypothetical governmental action that in some way engages in this year's resolution, right? So the expectation when you enter into different debates this year will be that an affirmative team will read a plan that in some way has the United States federal government increase its economic and/or diplomatic engagement with the People's Republic of China. If a team does not do this and they have not engaged the resolution and they've gotten up and talking about significantly curtailing our domestic surveillance or talking about why we should radically reject United States imperialism, those might be interesting topics of conversation, but none of them have engaged in the resolutional question of whether or not the United States should increase its diplomatic and/or economic engagement with China. Right, so when we think about topicality, we are thinking of how the affirmative teams are engaging in this year's resolution. Now, another component of topicality is that topicality aims to establish a vision of the resolution and the topic, right? So this resolution is not something that has just come out of nowhere. It is not something that was randomly selected. It was thought of by a group of very smart people, right? This thing called a topic committee. So a committee of people who were like, hey, what are some different really educational topics that young debaters in high school should be talking about? And they, created kind of a slate of resolutions. And then a bunch of coaches throughout the country cast their vote on what they thought would be the most educational debates for all of you to be having for the 2016 to 2017 year. And from that, a resolution was chosen. And this resolution is not just like a generic topic of conversation. It's not just a generic, hey, we should call China up on the phone. Rather, it was chosen and crafted very specifically with lots of specific intentions behind the different words that make up the resolution. And what I mean by that is there is a reason that the words and/or were chosen when we talk about engagement. There's a reason that diplomatic engagement and economic engagement were words that were chosen for this year's resolution. There's a reason that we chose to say the People's Republic of China rather than simply saying China. And similarly, there's a reason that we chose to say the United States federal government versus the United States. Because there was a lot of intent behind those different words and expectations for the types of debates that those specific words and phrases would foster, we should have a lot of respect for what those words would look like and for how those phrases can play out in terms of affirmatives writing their plain texts and constructing advantages, right? So topicality is kind of getting at the question of what those different words mean and how they can manifest in our different debate arguments, right? So topical engagement is kind of getting at not only did an affirmative team choose to talk about hanging out with China and increasing our engagement with them, but there are very specific words that were chosen so that we could have debates over very specific types of engagement with a very specific sector of people. So why read topicality? We read topicality for a variety of reasons. First and foremost is topicality can be used to determine the debatability of an affirmative, right? So this is getting at the core question of, can teams adequately prepare against the affirmative's plan? So the examples I gave earlier about a radical rejection of United States imperialism, or an affirmative that talks about substantially curtailing our domestic surveillance, right? These may be very interesting topics of conversation, but these are not necessarily things that you come into this year, this 2016 to 2017 year, prepared to debate against, right? Domestic surveillance was a topic for last year. Radical rejection of imperialism is not something that came from the different resolutional slates. It is not this year's resolution, which means that you have not done all of your research and all of your practice rounds and all of your work with your coaches preparing against those topics of conversation. You have prepared very specifically against whether or not the United States should increase its economic and or diplomatic engagement with the People's Republic of China. So topicality is kind of asking that question of, were you able to debate against the affirmative when you came into the round? On the previous slide, I had a component of my definition of topicality that said that topicality is what we call a procedural issue. And when we say procedural issues, that matters quite a bit, because procedural issues are issues that come before any other debate question, right? So when we think of something that is a procedural, it is something that comes prior to an affirmative even being able to talk about their awesome advantages. It comes prior to debating out counterplans or disadvantages or criticisms or anything else, because if an affirmative team has not met their burden and proved that they have engaged in this year's resolution, then that begs the question of why you should have to discuss any of those other topics of conversation. Why is it that you should have to discuss an affirmative's advantages if you are not prepared to debate against those advantages in the first place? Right? So procedural issues can include things like topicality, framework, and some might also categorize theoretical objections in that category of being procedurals. But the point that I'm trying to emphasize here is that procedural issues are things that come before anything else. So if you were not prepared to debate against an affirmative's plan in the first place, then you shouldn't have to have this debate. So many teams will read topicality to determine whether or not the affirmative was debatable at all, and whether or not this debate should have occurred. Another reason that teams read topicality is to determine if the affirmative is a good vision of this year's topic, right? So this is getting at this fundamental question of whether or not teams should prepare against the affirmative's plan, right? So it is possible that perhaps an affirmative has gotten up and has talked about the ways that they can increase our engagement with China, but perhaps they have not done so in a way that was necessarily educational for you as a young debater. Perhaps they have not done so in a way that really increases our economic or diplomatic engagement with China. Perhaps they have increased our military engagement with China. And again, while that might be something that is interesting to talk about, that begs the question of whether or not you should, as the negative, have had to prepare against affirmatives that are based off of military engagement, right? Why is it that you should have to spend so much of your precious time as high school students looking for things that fall beyond the scope of the resolution? Why is it that you should be interpreting engagement to mean military when the resolution specifically states economic and or diplomatic, right? These are really important questions that you want to be asking yourself. Should teams be preparing against the affirmative's plan? Another reason that teams may choose to read topicality is that topicality can be something that is used to help you strategically in other areas of the debate. And what I mean by this is that it is not necessarily your number one plan to go for topicality in the 2NR, but topicality can be used to help bolster other positions. Specifically, topicality can often be read as a mechanism to help you establish counterplan competition. And I'm not going to go too in-depth on that, because obviously today's lecture is just to provide you kind of an introductory overview to what topicality is and how to debate it. So counterplans are a little bit out of the scope of what I want to be talking about, but I just want you to be aware that there are ways to read topicality in order to prove that different positions that you enter into a debate can be relevant and that much more important. Another reason that teams can choose to read topicality is that topicality is often considered to be a no-risk option. When I say no-risk option, I mean it is not, in most cases, it is not a risk for a negative team to read topicality. In most cases, an affirmative team cannot make a negative lose for reading topicality. It is only possible for negatives to make affirmatives lose if they are not topical. Right, so what I mean by that is it kind of goes back to this idea of topicality being a procedural issue. If topicality is truly something that comes prior to every other issue in a debate, it means the topicality is a must-answer position that a negative can introduce, right? So if a 1NC gets up and they say, 3 off, here's our topicality argument, here's our disadvantage, and here's our counter plan. An affirmative, no matter what, must answer the topicality violation, because if they do not, they will likely lose the debate, because they have not proved that they should have even entered their affirmative into the debate in the first place, right? But negatives generally do not have to extend topicality if they choose not to. If they decide that an affirmative is sufficiently topical, then they do not have to extend it or talk about it in the block or the 2NR at all. And that can be really strategic for the purpose of time trade-offs, right? If an affirmative has to spend 30 to 40 seconds explaining why they are in fact topical, that can be helpful for you and the negative team, because perhaps that means that's 30 to 40 seconds less time that an affirmative or 2AC has to spend on the really sweet dissad that you want to go for. And because debate is such a time-pressed activity, it can really matter what types of time trade-offs you're able to establish earlier on in the debate. And the last reason that most teams may choose to read topicality is that topicality is a stock issue. Now, it is not necessarily the case that all states in the U.S. Refer to the stock issues as being kind of the core components of debates, but places like Wyoming in particular, stock issues are things that really matter to lots of judges and lots of coaches. So having an affirmative that is topical and begging the question of whether or not an affirmative actually is topical is something that can be very critical to that particular audience. So, next, what are the parts of a topicality argument on the negative? There are 4 main parts. The first main part that makes up a topicality argument is the interpretation and definition component, right? So when we talked earlier about the different words that were chosen to craft this year's resolution, the interpretation component attempts to take some of these words or phrases and interpret them in a specific way, and oftentimes this interpretation will include a definition behind it in order to prove that that interpretation is one that is correct. The next component of a topicality argument is the violation and or the link, right? So the violation is how has the affirmative violated your interpretation? How is the affirmative how does the affirmative not meet your interpretation of the words economic engagement or the People's Republic of China, right? When we say link, we mean this is your link to topicality. This is your proof that the affirmative has done something that is not in fact topical. The next component of a topicality argument is the impact debate. When I say impact debate, I mean these are the reasons to prefer and the standards. When we think about procedural issues such as topicality, framework, and or theory arguments, the 2 main impacts that can be read and that get explained are things like fairness and education. Now, remember, every argument that you want to have in debate has to have an impact, right? It has to have a reason for why the judge should even care about your arguments, right? So fairness and education are the reasons that a judge should care about whether or not an affirmative team was in fact topical, right? So when you're setting up your standards, you really want to set them up in such a way that establishes why what the affirmative has done is something that is not fair or not educational for you as a young debater. And lastly is a framing argument, right? So you want to provide a filter for the judge that proves that kind of allows them a lens through which they can evaluate topicality at the end of a debate, right? So what we use as our primary framing issue on the negative, debating against topicality, is this thing that's called competing interpretations. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. So what are common responses that are made by affirmative teams who are debating against topicality? Well, again, there are 4 main parts to this. the first argument you want to have is you want to have a we meet argument. Now, a we meet argument you can think of kind of as a no link argument. After the affirmative has after the negative has presented their interpretation of what a word or a phrase in the resolution should mean, you want to have a reason for why you have in fact met that interpretation. What is it that you have done that in fact has made you topical? They say that economic engagement has to include like a bilateral trade agreement, and perhaps your affirmative has in some way increased economic engagement with China by increasing our bilateral trade or establishing a bilateral trade negotiation with China. Those are ways in which you can be like, actually, we did that. We meet that interpretation. There's not a link to your topicality argument. The next component of an affirmative response is a counterinterpretation and definition. So just as the negative has chosen to interpret a specific word or phrase in this year's resolution, you also want to provide a counter interpretation or of that same word or phrase in the resolution to prove that you are, in fact, topical, just perhaps under a different interpretation of this year's topic. And you want to have definitions that substantiate why this interpretation is one that is good for debate. Now, next, you want to have your counter standards and reasons to prefer. Right, just as we talk about why all of procedural issues are getting at these core questions of whether or not the affirmative has done something that is educational or fair, you as the affirmative want to have reasons why your counter interpretation is one that is very educational for all of you young debaters and one that is fair enough for negatives to compete against. And lastly, you want to have a framing issue. And your framing issue should not be competing interpretations, but should be this thing that is called reasonability. And again, I will explain that in a couple slides here. So just to provide you with some more detail on what we mean by interpretation and violation on the negative. An interpretation simply means to interpret the resolution by defining words and phrases in the resolution, and the violation is to explain how the affirmative's plain text does not meet those definitions, right? So why is it that what the affirmative has done does not, in fact, meet your interpretation of economic engagement or the People's Republic of China, etc.? The negative standards and reasons to prefer, right? So these are kind of the different lenses through which we can use to set up our impacts of fairness in education. Oftentimes, the reasons to prefer that are chosen by negative teams are things like flexibility, ground, and predictable limits. Now, when I say flexibility, I am referring to your ability as a negative team to be able to flexibly engage with what the affirmative has presented, right? So was it possible for you as the negative team to be able to read multiple disadvantages, multiple counterplans? Did you have lots of different things that you could flexibly go for and to compete against an affirmative team? Or were you kind of stuck with one position based on how the affirmative plain text was read? If it is the case that you were only stuck with like one particular dissad that you could read or, one very generic counterplan, perhaps you are losing out on the flexibility that you could potentially have had the affirmative plain text been written in a more topical manner. Another argument that is commonly used by negative teams is this idea of ground, right? So kind of similarly with, the flexibility argument, you want to make sure that the ground that the affirmative's plain text provides you with is ground that is good. Is it educational for you to only have one very generic disadvantage to read against this affirmative's plain text? If not, perhaps that is a reason that what the affirmative has presented is something that is uneducational and should be rejected. Right? So when you're explaining ground arguments, you want to have a reason that what they have done, the way that the plain text is written is something that very much limits you in terms of what you are able to respond against the affirmative with, and why that is worse for you as a debater, both in terms of your ability to fairly compete against the 1AC and also to have the most educational debate that you could possibly have. The last thing that's kind of used to set up these fairness and education impacts for topicality is this idea of predictable limits, right? So perhaps it is possible that the affirmative has presented you with a plain text that in some ways does increase our economic and or diplomatic engagement with the People's Republic of China. But the question is, was it one that was predictable? Did they have an affirmative or choose an affirmative from a predictable literature base that made it possible for you to generate specific links? Or did an affirmative have a plain text that was so nuanced and so skewed in the literature that you have to rely on your most generic of positions? And then you have to kind of question whether or not having very generic positions to read against a very specific plan is something that is necessarily good for educational debates. Or is it unfair because perhaps you were not able to predict the small facet of the resolution that the 1AC is choosing to talk about? This is kind of the reason why having very particular interpretations that can resolve these questions of flexibility, ground, and predictable limits for the negative really matters. And last thing I'll say about these are that you can think of kind of these three things, so flexibility, predictable limits, and ground, as being net benefits to your version and your vision of what this year's topic should look like, right? So if you have if you have an interpretation that says that economic engagement can only be something that is bilateral, and you have reasons why that is best for negative flexibility, best for negative ground, and best for predictable limits for both the negative and the affirmative, that can be a net benefit or a reason that your interpretation of the topic is really good and really educational and fair for all teams, and something that a judge should choose at the end of the debate. So oftentimes the counter standards that are used and applied by affirmative teams include things such as creativity, ground, and advantage areas. So just as negative teams want to be able to have the flexibility to compete against an affirmative with many different arguments and things to read, affirmatives also want to have the ability to be creative, right? They want to have the ability to innovate throughout the season, to not be stuck with one specific affirmative, with one specific plain text, because that can get really boring and it can lead to kind of a year's worth of super stale debates that maybe aren't as interesting to have, right? So oftentimes affirmatives will say, yes, perhaps we are not the broad, perhaps we do not make the world the most fair for you as the negative, but it's really important for us as the affirmative to be able to innovate throughout the year, because that helps us as young debaters to research and educate ourselves on different creative solutions that we can have in order to increase our engagement with China. Other things that affirmatives can say is they can talk about the idea of ground. They can have a reason that, although they may not provide for the perfect negative ground, perhaps not the perfect scenario where the negative gets to read their favorite disadvantage, they could still have reasons why negatives have access to lots of different arguments and lots of different generics that are in fact good for the type of education that we are expected to get on this year's topic. Why it is that the affirmative's interpretation or counter-interpretation is one that is beneficial for talking about increasing engagement with the People's Republic of China. And lastly is this idea of advantage areas, right? So this year's topic has two different kind of mechanisms for engagement, right? There's economic engagement and diplomatic engagement. And it is perhaps possible that teams that choose to increase our economic engagement with China may say that there are limited advantage areas that they can kind of work from, right? So having kind of more flexibility in terms of their plan mechanism can help them broaden some of those advantage areas so that we kind of get more of that innovation and learn about unique pockets of this year's topic that we wouldn't otherwise have access to. Now, again, you can also think of the affirmative's counter-interpretation as the affirmative's vision of the topic that includes the affirmative. You can think of the counter-standards as the net benefits to that counter-interpretation. So the reasons why these three things make the affirmative's counter-interpretation more educational or more fair for debate. So next is negative framing, right? So we talked about this being kind of the filter that the judge can use at the end of a debate to decide what arguments matter in terms of topicality. And so for the negative, you want to be setting up this frame of competing interpretations. Competing interpretations simply means at the end of the debate, the judge should choose between two different interpretations in order to decide what is the best interpretation for this year's topic and for a year's worth of debates and for what occurred in this round specifically. Some key considerations to keep in mind when you are thinking through what makes up a good interpretation are things like the quality of evidence that you're reading, right? So when you have your interpretation, where does the evidence come from that you are citing, right? Is it someone that who's just a writer for Newsmax, or is it a person at the State Department, right? All of these things can implicate whether or not we should choose one interpretation over another. Perhaps you are reading a definition that comes from a dictionary, right? How does that implicate what it is that you were talking about versus an interpretation that is contextual, where somebody is writing about economic engagement in the context of China, right? All of these things can implicate whether or not your interpretation is preferable to the other teams. The next thing to consider when thinking about competing interpretations is the literature base. Does your interpretation really reflect the literature base that exists on this year's topic? Does the interpretation you provide for economic engagement really reflect the way that economic engagement works between the United States and China right now? And lastly is you should think about the details in the resolution that the debate community should prefer to debate about and talk about. Why is it that your interpretation allows us kind of the minutia that we would not get in other years' topics? Why does it matter to have debates over the phrase economic engagement versus simply having a debate over the term engagement? Why does that term of art really matter in terms of debate? So next is affirmative framing, right? So we think about reasonability. So what does reasonability mean? Reasonability suggests that even if the affirmative's interpretation of the topic is imperfect, that the affirmative is still reasonably topical. So how do you determine if something is reasonably topical? Well, in all honesty, reasonability is something that is inherently subjective, right? Something can always be reasonable, but kind of the ways that we can think about reasonability in terms of debates is if the affirmative is able to prove that it is not impossible for the negative to predict the affirmative, then perhaps they are reasonably topical because they are reasonably grounded in the literature base, right? They are reasonably tied to the different words in the resolution. It is possible for natives to engage in them. And lastly is reasonability can be a reason for why affirmatives should debate, or for why affirmatives should explain that hard debate is good debate, right? So yes, perhaps the affirmative does not present you with the easiest thing to debate against, but having debates that are more difficult for negatives can be good for negative teams because they have to get more creative, they have to do more research, they have to push themselves during the year to, kind of keep up with the innovation from affirmative teams, right? So if hard debate is good debate because it makes you think, it makes you research more, then perhaps debate becomes more educational. And that can be a reason that judges ought to prefer reasonability filters at the end of the debate over competing interpretations. Because if an affirmative is reasonably topical, that means that you can go on and you can discuss all of the other components of the debate, like the disadvantages, counterplans, affirmative advantages, etc., because those are all good in education. Many of you may have heard of these terms extra topicality and effect topicality, and I'm going to give you kind of a brief explanation for what these terms mean, just so that you have them kind of in your debate bank of knowledge. So extra topicality is when the affirmative plain text includes components that extend beyond the scope of the resolution, right? So this means that it simply does something extra. So an example of this would be increasing economic engagement with China and also creating world peace. Right, so the component of this plain text would increase economic engagement with China, right, which is something that is good because it is topical, it engages directly in this year's resolution. But the component that is extra topical is this idea of creating world peace, right? And the reason that we would reject things that are extra topical is because, well, they kind of get at these things of fairness and education. It's probably not fair for you to debate about creating world peace because that's not within the scope of this year's resolution. It is something that is extra than that. And, that's not educational if you can't predict it and you cannot learn about it ahead of time because it's not within the scope of you as a debater's research parameters. So oftentimes you can include extra topicality as an addendum onto a normal topicality violation. And extra topicality is something that teams can lose on if they don't answer it, so it's really good to know that it exists. The same goes for effects topicality. So effects topicality simply means that the affirmative's plan text does not directly meet the resolution, but rather that the effect of the plan is a topical action. That can be kind of confusing, so to kind of contextualize this for you is think about what it would mean if the United States decreased trade barriers against China. Well, decreasing trade barriers can have the effect of increasing our economic engagement with China, right, because it creates a more open market between the two countries, but this does not directly have the effect of increasing trade, because it takes the action of decreasing trade barriers in order to increase economic engagement later. And that is something that can be unfair because the direct effect of the plan is not one that is a topical action. So the next part of this lecture is explaining how to debate topicality and execute on it when you are on the negative. So I've separated this into a few steps to kind of make this easier for you to understand the process that goes into both setting up topicality arguments and also just debating topicality. So step one is constructing a topicality core, right? So what I mean by that is before every season, you should have kind of a document that has like a core of all of your 1 and C shells or different possible violations that you can read against any number of affirmative teams, right? Because you're going to be debating against lots of different teams out there, and you want to be prepared for lots of different scenarios and lots of new plan texts, and you want to make sure that you've got your bases covered in case you debate against an affirmative that you did not predict beforehand. So the ways that you can go about constructing a topicality core include, first and foremost, reading the resolution, right? And after you've read the resolution, you want to go on and research as many definitions for each word and phrase in the resolution as possible. And when you are doing this, you want to think about what definitions and interpretations would be unfair to debate against, right? So when you're thinking about this year's resolution, you want to think about what some of the words in the resolution can mean, right? So what does it mean when we say economic engagement? What can economic engagement include? What can the People's Republic of China include? And then you want to think about how it would be unfair to debate against certain interpretations of those different words and those different phrases. After you've done those things, you can write 1 and C shells that include all of the components that we've explained previously, right? So you want to make sure you have your interpretation, and then your impacts, your reasons to prefer, and then your framing of why competing interpretation should be something that is preferred. And lastly, you should look at CAMP files and the Open Evidence Project as good resources for you to determine what common topicality violations are out there in order to get you started on understanding what the different words and phrases in the resolution can mean. So key phrases on this year's topic to keep in mind are engagement, increase, and the People's Republic of China. Now, obviously, you can also interrogate some of the different words, but I think that these are ones that are very unique to this year's resolution and ones to keep in mind. So when we think about engagement, right, some things you can consider are, well, what does engagement mean? Does it mean bilateral engagement? Or does it mean there can be multilateral engagement? Can there be more countries involved in the process than just the United States and China? Can it include military engagement if the term of art is kind of economic and or diplomatic engagement? Can it be a quid pro quo? Or does it have to be government to government? Does it have to be the United States talking to the People's Republic of China, or can it be different organizations? So then there's the word increase, right? Can increase include removing restrictions, or would that be something that is effects topical? Should an increase have to be qualitative, or should it only be quantitative? Should there be a numerical increase in order for you to be able to debate against affirmative teams? Think about what the People's Republic of China can mean. Does it mean just the government? Who all is included in that? And these are important questions, and I'm not saying that these are kind of the restrictions you should have with topicality, but I'm saying that you should ask yourself these different types of questions when you're constructing topicality cores and thinking through topicality violations, because they can help you think through what types of affirmatives would be uneducational or unfair to debate against. So, step 2 of debating topicality on the negative is putting your topicality shell in the 1 and C. So, in order to do this, the first thing that you want to do is you want to read the affirmative plain text, right? The next thing is you want to determine what the affirmative has done that is unfair and uneducational, and find an interpretation from your topicality core that you've established that kind of links up with those explanations for why the affirmative was unfair or uneducational. And then you want to use that interpretation and explain how their specific plain text does not meet your interpretation, and then do the other things we talked about, like adding in your standards, your impacts, and providing your framing. Step 3 is how to extend topicality in the block. Well, the first thing is you want to figure out when it is strategic to extend topicality. Kind of the 3 things that I think are important considerations in determining whether or not it's strategic to extend topicality is to determine, 1, if the affirmative is missing a core component of a topicality argument, right? And what I mean by this is, has the affirmative forgotten to include a counter-interpretation? Do they have standards for why what they've done is educational or fair? If they're missing those things, or if they're missing a framing argument for why reasonability is something that ought to be preferred, that would make your job as the negative a lot easier, because you already have all of that set up in the 1 and C, and you just need to extend them. Another reason it could be strategic to extend topicality is it can provide you with more options. Perhaps you are uncertain as to whether or not this disadvantage you've read is really going to be the game winner. Maybe you don't know how, if the affirmative's got the goods on answering the elections disadvantage. And if you're a little bit uncertain of whether or not you'll actually be able to definitively win kind of the other positions you're introducing in the debate, topicality can be a great crutch, because affirmatives must be topical in order for them to win a debate. If they're not topical, then none of the other positions even matter. And the other reason it can be strategic to extend topicality is perhaps the affirmative is truly intopical. Perhaps the affirmative has just talked about radically rethinking United States imperialism, which would be something that is not engaging in this year's resolution. So why is it that you should have had to have this debate in the first place? So those are kind of my 3 points for why it can be strategic to extend topicality into the block. So the ways that you actually execute on this are, the first thing you want to do is you want to extend your interpretation. You want to make it clear to the judge what your interpretation of this year's resolution ought to be. Then you want to provide an explanation for why that interpretation is comparatively better than the interpretation that the 2AC has provided. Then you want to impact out your violation. You want to explain why the affirmative has not met this, and why what they have done is something that is uneducational and unfair. And these are kind of the different filters I've talked about before, with things like flexibility and predictable limits, etc. Then you want to make sure that you answer the 2AC arguments, right, in a line-by-line fashion, right? So making sure that you are addressing their counter standards, talk about why your interpretation is better than the interpretation they provided, etc. And don't forget your framing issues. You want to have a reason why the judge should evaluate topicality through the lens of competing interpretations over reasonability. And step 4, extending topicality when you are in the 2NR. The first thing that you want to do is you want to start with your impact filter. Remind the judge how it is they should be evaluating the topicality debate, right? So you are talking about why competing interpretations matters. So you want to talk about why competing interpretations allows kind of allows us to navigate through what the different words in the topic can mean, and to find the best interpretation of the topic so that we can have the best year's worth of debates that we can possibly have, right? Over reasonability, which can lead to harder debate and make it more difficult for negative teams to compete. The next thing you want to do is you want to explain your impacts, right? How is it that the affirmative made the debate impossible? How was the AF uneducational? And how was the affirmative unfair? And also think about what competing interpretations means. If you allow the affirmative's interpretation in the topic, then perhaps it justifies lots and lots and lots of other affirmatives that would be really unfair. So even if it is the case that the affirmative is one that just allows even if it is the case that the affirmative itself was not so bad, perhaps their interpretation justifies lots and lots of really unfair and uneducational affirmatives out there that you as a negative should not have to debate against, right? So these are ways in which you can impact out your argument, and explaining why limits really matters, and explaining why ground really matters. Having these impacts really matters because it's telling the judge why it is that they should actually care about the affirmative being topical. Next, you want to make sure that you are extending your counterinterpretation as a way to resolve your impacts, right? So it doesn't matter if you just have reasons for why what the affirmative has done is something that is uneducational or unfair, but you need to have a reason for why the interpretation that you have provided is one that can overcome some of these issues. Why it is that your interpretation allows for negative ground. Why it is that your interpretation is one that is educational. Why yours sets a cap on the number of different affirmatives out there to make your research burden a little easier. Other helpful things that you can do are you can provide a case list. And when I say case list, I mean you can do this in two ways. You can either provide a case list of different argument or of different unfair and uneducational affirmatives that the affirmative's interpretation of topicality would justify, right? So things that would kind of like magnify all the impacts you've talked about previously. And you can also provide a case list for the different types of good affirmatives that your interpretation would allow for to prove that you create kind of the most educational and fair debates for a year's worth of debates. And lastly, you want to make sure you answer their arguments. You will not get ahead in many debates if you only have extended your arguments. You want to make sure that you are interacting what they have said, because that's the whole point of debate, is to communicate and have a dialogue back and forth between different arguments and whose vision of the topic is best. So, last thing to consider is, what if you're not going for topicality? Unless there is offense of some sort, you should not put topicality in your order or go to the page at all, right? It's a no-risk option for you, so you don't have to worry about it. The only exceptions are when there is some sort of offensive reason that you should lose just for reading topicality. Some people call these things reverse voting issues, which are generally unpersuasive, but they can still be voted on by some judges in the activity. And other things are perhaps people will make the argument that topicality is something that is on, or reading topicality is something that replicates some sort of like some sort of violence in terms of scholarship, why it is bad to tell certain people how they should be debating. Right, these are examples of offensive arguments, but for the most part, especially if you're engaging in a very policy affirmative, you do not have to go for the topicality page or kick out of it. Next thing is how to debate against topicality when you're affirmative. I've also organized this in terms of the different steps, right? So step one is you want to determine what topicality violations you will need to answer throughout the year. So the things that are involved in this process are, first, you want to make sure that you are writing a topical plan text in order to try to hedge against lots and lots of different T violations that people can read against you. Second is you want to think through what your plan text does and what it means, right? So you have to think through, does your plan text establish a quid pro quo, or is it not a quid pro quo? Is it diplomatic engagement, or is it economic engagement? And all of these things will implicate the different types of topicality violations you will have to prepare for throughout the year. And next thing is you also can look through the different evidence that exists on an open evidence project and CAMP files in order to assess the different violations that people can read and the different violations, more importantly, that will link to the plan that you have written. Step two is you want to construct your 2AC shells against common T violations. So after you have created your list of different T violations that people can and will likely read against you, you want to create a separate 2AC for each violation. Now there can be overlap in this, right? So you can have lots of the same reasons why reasonability is better as a filter than competing interpretations, but you want to ensure that your counter interpretation is one that is directly responsive to the words that the negative chose to define, right? You want to make sure that if a negative team is interpreting the words economic engagement, you have a counter interpretation of economic engagement, not another random portion of the resolution, because that is not relevant to this particular topicality debate. And then you want to figure out why it is that your plan and plans like yours are both fair and educational, and you should include those as reasons for why your counter standard should be preferred. Step three is how to answer topicality in the 1AR and the 2AR. Things that you need to make sure that you extend are, you need to ensure that you are extending your counter interpretation. And then you want to have at least one, but preferably a few reasons why your interpretation is good, right? So these are the reasons that your interpretation is educational and fair for debate. Then you want to have at least one, but again, preferably a few reasons why their interpretation is bad, why their interpretation would be worse for AF creativity and innovation throughout the year, why it would be unfair for affirmatives to have to engage in a very limited interpretation of the topic. And you want to make sure that you are establishing reasonability as your filter. Why is it that you should prefer reasonability over competing interpretations? And lastly is when you are debating topicality on the affirmative, I just want to have these here so that you can include them in your bank of knowledge and kind of avoid some of these common missteps. Topicality is about definitions, and it is about the specific words that were chosen in the resolution. Topicality is not generic debate jargon, right? So it is not very persuasive to just be like, our affirmative was really educational, so we should talk about it, and education matters. You want to have a reason why your interpretation of the resolution and the words in the resolution matters. You want to talk really about what your evidence is saying and impacting out why that evidence really matters versus the evidence that the negative team has provided, right? And it is very unpersuasive to say the following things. It is unpersuasive to just say that you've debated us before, so this is fair, because that doesn't matter in terms of whether or not the affirmative has established a good vision for the topic, why what you have done is justified in terms of the different things that you would allow. It is not very persuasive to say that we are fair because we disclosed before the round, because oftentimes the 20 to 30 minutes you have before a debate round is not adequate time to prepare against an affirmative, particularly if it is one that was unfair to debate against in the first place. It is also unpersuasive to say that you have read things against us, so we were not unfair, because just because you read something, that does not mean that the things read or introduced into the debate are things that were good or should have been talked about in the first place, because perhaps they were just very generic positions that are not the most educational for young debaters. And it is also very unpersuasive to say that topicality is a reverse voting issue. Why? Because topicality is a prima facie burden for the affirmative. It is a procedural issue that comes prior to other questions. It is the burden of the affirmative to prove that they were topical before you should be able to talk about other things. So saying that a negative team reading T is just a time suck is very unpersuasive, because it does not really get at the core question of whether or not the affirmative has adequately engaged in this year's resolution. So those are my notes on how to debate topicality and kind of what topicality is. If you have any questions, feel free to send me an email. My email is mmarcum959@gmail.com. Yeah, so hope that helps.